are live. I'm Liz McDade, a huge Columbo fan and a small business owner living in Santa Cruz, California. And this is my brother.
I'm Paul McDade, an editor, assistant editor, and sometimes actor working in the TV and film industry in Los Angeles.
All right, this is a special episode of Trenchcoat Cigar Peugeot Wandering with Columbo, because today we're interviewing author David Koenig. David recently published a new account of the creation and filming of Columbo titled Shooting Columbo, The Lives and Deaths of TV's Rumpled Detective. He's authored several other books, including Mouse Tales, A Behind the Ears Look at Disneyland, Reality Land, True Life Adventures at Walt Disney World, and Danny Kaye, King of Jesters. Welcome, David.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. First off, thank you so much for writing this book. It's full of really wonderful stories about how this amazing show came together. Mm-hmm. And it's really well written and super fun to read. I've already finished it. And I really think this is any Columbo fans must-have addition to their library. So thanks for creating this.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for saying that. That was the whole idea, was that I was dying to read a book like this and waited and figured, well, somebody's got to do it. So that's what convinced me to write it, because I so much wanted to read it.
Yeah, absolutely. That was actually going to be my first question. I know you've talked a bit about why you wrote this book in at least one other interview that we saw. But I know that our listeners would love to hear your connection to Columbo and how you decided to write this book.
Well, I grew up with Columbo. It was airing in its original NBC seasons in the 1970s, in the early 1970s when I was a little kid. And it was my mom's favorite show. And it was on right after The Wonderful World of Disney, which was the kids' favorite show. And we only had one television set. So that it just stayed on that channel, unless, of course, it was a week for McCloud or McMillan and Wife. And then we switched over to Streets of San Francisco or something else that was more to the parents' fancy. But that's how I grew up, falling in love with this character, with this extremely unique, clever format. And just it stayed with me my whole life. And I've always been curious about how did they really make these episodes? They're so clever, and how did that character come to be? Mm-hmm. And there would always be hints, like in the TV Guide, there'd be stories that sort of hinted that Peter Falk could be a little bit of trouble behind the scenes, but never any details. And finally, I was able to find out what really happened.
Wow, yeah, you definitely did. You've got all kinds of great behind the scenes in this book about how it was coming together and what exactly Peter Falk was doing. It's really, really great.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned like there was little rumblings of what he might be like. In your book, like on page 27, it says, at first Falk chafed against the lack of structure. Working with Cassavetes, he hated it and told Cassavetes he would never work for him again. Falk also began incorporating this new freedom into his acting, other projects. I thought that this is a little bit of a turn here. I thought that was really interesting that Columbo, or that Peter Falk, had this sort of difficult thing with Cassavetes, but then he ended up sort of incorporating what he learned from him, even though it upset him so much. And then it helped create the way he worked, just like really making it the best he could, plus the improvisation that perhaps he learned from Cassavetes.
Yeah, well, Cassavetes was his idol. I mean, he loved all his work. He loved the freedom he had. To him, John Cassavetes was everything he wanted to be. He wanted to be confident, tall, handsome, every attribute that he grew up his whole life wanting to be, be respected as an artist. That was John Cassavetes. And so he was excited to work with him. But that first experience working together on one of the Cassavetes movies, Husband, started out very rocky, because it was everything, the opposite of how Peter Falk was used to working. So he was very, very nervous during the filming of that picture. But once it was over, he realized, wow, that was actually stretched me in a very uncomfortable way, but I can't imagine working any differently. And right after that, he agreed to make Columbo a series. And you can tell the difference between the two pilots, how much Peter Falk started pouring himself into that character. And just, he seems so much more free, like he's winging it, even though, he started out with the suggestions of the script. But in Prescription Murder, he's by the book, and there's still a little bit of that twinkle in the eye because that's who he is. But he really started putting himself into the role after appearing with Cassavetes, and that's where Columbo really clicked.
Yeah. So fascinating how these smaller or past experiences, you're able to piece them together to help us understand, what was happening with Peter Falk and this character. And I have sort of a related question, but I really had no idea. I probably should have known, but I had no idea how involved Peter Falk was in the writing and the production, and then subsequently how much he really slowed things down and caused issues. And so you really shed a light on what was happening there. And so I guess we don't need to do too much analysis, but do you have a sense of what his motivation was in terms of, really getting so involved? Was it a sense of worrying about the success of the show, or not trusting that the producers were on the right path? Or was he worried about his own character being too one-dimensional? Or was this an ego issue? Or maybe was it some combination?
It was all of the above. All of the above. Yeah, he was naturally a very insecure person, even though he was one of the most talented actors around. I mean, he was quickly recognized with Academy Award nominations and Emmy Awards, and I mean, extremely celebrated as this unique, amazing actor. Yet he always considered himself inferior, and he always was distrustful of others because he looked around and said, I'm better than these people and I'm not very good. So, who's there to trust? So every once in a while in his life, he'd stumble onto these, these geniuses like Cassavetes and later Patrick McGowan and Dick Simmons and a couple other people in his life who he realized, oh my gosh, these guys can do even more than what I can. And so whatever those people said, he would cede to them. But for the most part, he was distrustful of his producers, of his writers, of everyone. And he was so determined to make Columbo a piece of art, the greatest television show ever and the greatest character ever, that he was constantly rewriting lines, rewriting scripts, making other changes behind the scenes, even in editing, trying to, show up they eventually had to lock him out of the editing room because he was always tinkering with things, and that wasn't his job. Right. So it was, it started out slowly in the first season, especially since Levinson and Link, the character and show's creators, were the executive producers that season, and they took nothing from no one, and they certainly weren't going to listen to this actor telling them how to do their job. So that created this, amazing daily, extremely loud conflicts. And then it's when they left that Peter first began to get that little taste of power that grew and grew and grew.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating. Just reading about how all that is unfolding. It's almost feels like a small miracle that these shows made it onto the air and continued year after year.
In fact, in many ways, they were the better for it. I mean, if Peter Falk wouldn't have cared, if he would have just shown up and punched the time card and just read what was on the script, I think it would have been, no matter how good the scripts were, it would have been like season after season of Prescription Murder, which is a great, for me, probably the best written of all the Columbo mysteries there were, but yet it's a little flat because, the character is undeveloped. He's not that guy we would come to know and love.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of him doing multiple takes, Peter Falk doing multiple takes, do you think that he would also recognize that if he did multiple takes, he could frustrate the actor, like let's say Robert Culp, and intentionally get them really angry, and it would be coming right off, be right on the celluloid. You could see it, Do you think that he did some of that when he would want to do those retakes?
That's a great supposition. I, of course, can't read his mind, especially back in the past. So I don't know exactly his true motivation, but I would not be surprised if that was if that was part of what he was doing, because I know he did like to mix things up. He never delivered the lines as they were written on the page, ever. He rewrote every line Columbo ever delivered over those, 60 some episodes. Once it became a series, he would not memorize them until he got to the set, and then he would try them out one way. Rehearsal number 2, try it out second. The next rehearsal, try it out different. The first take, try it out a different way. He would be 10, 20, sometimes 30 takes trying to do it over and over and over again. His intention was, how would Columbo really deliver this line? This mythical person in his head, he was trying to figure out how he would do the line. And sometimes he would make stuff up that had nothing to do with the line. And I wouldn't be surprised if that was to keep people on their toes. Some of the actors did not care for that at all, but others, like you mentioned, Robert Culp, no one loved that more than Robert Culp. He was a lot like Peter Falk, in that he liked to mix things up. He liked the spontaneity, the freshness, and he was very good on his feet. He was, I'm told he was a very unpleasant person in real life, but as an actor, he just thrived off of working with Peter, and he could hardly wait to be asked to do another.
Wow.
So interesting. One of the stories that you shared in your book is from, it's a story between McGoohan and Peter Falk from Identity Crisis. You state that McGoohan is sort of stretching Columbo's character in this episode, and you describe a moment in the episode where Columbo is coming to check on the murder victim at night under the pier, and he's more commanding towards the other police officers than he normally is. He's kind of, pushing people out of the way. And I just thought this was a really interesting observation that you uncovered and shared, because I love those little moments where we see a little more depth to his character. And I just wondered if you have any other thoughts on that relationship between McGoohan and Falk's portrayal of Columbo, or just how, we get to see these other little sides of the character at times.
Right. Well, I think Patrick McGoohan, who to me was one of the greatest actors, guest stars ever on Columbo, as well, directed and helped produce a number of episodes as well, in which was interesting because Patrick McGoohan did not like the show Columbo. He thought it was formulaic. He thought it was flat. It was uninteresting. It didn't change, but he really did like Peter Falk's character. So when he agreed to direct an episode, the first one, as you say, Identity Crisis, that was his aim. He wasn't much concerned about the mystery as much as he was with what else can I do with this character? How can I make him grow, arc, move forward, take him in slightly new directions? And he picked out parts of his the Columbo persona, such as the fact that he's trying to, in his mind, trick people, because to me, I've always thought of Columbo as that what you see with Columbo is mostly him. When he goes home, he's still forgetful and he's still aw shucks with his wife, and he really has a wife in my mind. But that he'll sort of exaggerate and play it up to get people at ease. McGoohan's thought was that the whole thing's an act. That he's one of the greatest detectives of all time. There's no way he could not know how great he is. There's no way his commander and the other police sergeants, after he solves, he's put Robert Culp in jail 3 times by this point. There's no way he could be this seeming dope. No one who knows him could fall for that. So that was the tact he took, was sort of playing up the falseness in the front of Columbo, and how that, what the real Columbo was like behind the fake front. And you'll see some moments in Identity Crisis, and then in his second episode that he directed at the end of the season, which they thought would be the final episode, The Last Salute to the Commodore, he really, pulls out all the stops and convincing Peter to just take this character places, that no one had thought to before, because he disregarded the character in thinking it was a real character. He thought it was was a false front. So what else can we do with it? if he's just making it all up.
Yeah. Yeah. Really interesting. I think it was more successful in Identity Crisis than in The Last Salute to the Commodore. That one, I think you have a line in here. It's something like, didn't just stretch him. He snapped. The character is snapped at this point. Went a little too far in terms of bringing in those other layers and sides to him.
Absolutely.
I really enjoyed the photographs that you have in here. And I had a question about Everett Chambers. You worked on Johnny Staccato with Cassavetes.
Right.
So you had really good notes from him. Were they like on a little binder, or how did you get a hold of? Did they photograph them for you, or how did you see those? What were those like? Like, was it like a calendar that he would have, or?
Well, Everett Chambers, who was a personal friend of Peter Falk's, who produced Cassavetes' television series Johnny Staccato in the 60s, who agreed as a favor to Peter Falk to produce several of the episodes. He agreed to produce 3 of the episodes during season 1, and then after 2, Levinson and Link were so overbearing on him, he quit and refused to do the 3rd. Then he came back to make Peter happy in the 4th season and produced the 4th, 5th, and the beginning of the 6th before Peter lost faith in him and fired him, which he didn't have the right to, but he did anyway because he was Peter Falk. But Everett, who's still around in his mid 90s in Northern California and is friendly yet feisty. It's a lot, I imagine, like Peter Falk. I can see why they got together so well. But Everett interviewed a number of times. And he has a razor sharp memory. He's the stories he could recreate, or as if I was there.
Wow.
Here from 40 and 50 years ago. As well, he kept many of his personal papers related to the show, his scripts, his production reports, his casting memos. So all the episodes, that was one of his duties, was figuring out, okay, who plays the villain, and he'd make a list for every episode. Okay, suitable for framing. He'd make his top 10 list or top 20 list of who he'd want to get, and then he'd sort of number them out. Okay, my first choice is such and such, and second and third, and then they'd start calling to see who was available and who was interested in it. And so he kept those for every episode he worked on.
Wow.
And then the production reports, memos to and from the studio. Everett is proud to say he was not a company man, unlike all the other producers who were company men who thought Universal first. He was Peter Falk first, because he knew that without Peter, first of all, he was his friend, but second of all, he knew that without Peter Falk, there was no show. You could have Columbo without NBC or without Universal. You can't have Columbo without Peter Falk. So that was his first priority, was always making Peter happy. And so he kept all his papers, and he donated them some years ago to Boston University. So I was able to view everything he donated, which is hundreds, if not thousands, of items of notes that were kept at the time that they were happening. It wasn't events that took place 50 years later that we were trying to recreate. It was, okay, here's what happened today on the set.
Wow.
And so that was very valuable. And as well, in addition to Everett, many, many others, probably 15 other folks, did the same thing. Kept their scripts and their personal papers. Jackson Gillis, who was one of the greatest writers ever on Columbo, he pioneered so many of the Columbo innovations. He donated his papers to the Writers Guild, and Levinson and Link donated theirs to the American Film Institute, and so on. So there's another great book on Columbo, which everyone probably has, called The Columbo File, and it's a terrific book. But the one advantage I had, with the disadvantage, is that Mark Dawidziak, who wrote that wonderful book, had access to Peter Falk and Levinson and Link and other people who have passed. But me, I had access to all this paperwork, which was not public, back then. And, so that was a great gift in being able to recreate the story of what really happened.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing. Yeah, some of the details that you have are just like, it's just really spectacular to feel like you're right there in the in the room where two people are having a conversation or a disagreement. So
yeah, that's the hope. I've always wondered if you want a great episode guide that tells you, the plot and the clues and some trivia and some fun stories about the people in the episode. Mark's book is your book. We're done. It's perfect. But for me, what I wanted in addition to that, instead of that, was, so what was it really like behind the scenes? How, if I were on the set, or if I were, a fly on the wall of a story conference, what would really be happening? How would those stories come together? How did they pick the scripts and discard the scripts that they chose and discarded? How did they change during the development of each episode? And once the cameras turned on, what sort of craziness happened at that point?
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I'm curious why you think Columbo is still such a popular series today, even though the last episode was 2003, I think, and the real heart of the series was in the 1970s.
Right. I think it's because of Peter Falk. I mean, it's a great show without him. I mean, but you can see, if you've ever seen, there's the very first version of Prescription Murder was called Enough Rope, and it's probably on YouTube somewhere, but it was this hour-long live television special, made the stage play of Levinson and Link's Prescription Murder, done as it was originally intended to be, with the type of actor that they had intended the part to be, which was just a flat, normal, 6 foot tall, angry looking 60s detective, hard boiled detective. And he plays it like that. And it's still the same script and it's still entertaining, but that's how Columbo would have been without Peter Falk. It's just, that type of person playing the role that type of way. And that wouldn't have lasted. But Peter Falk, by putting, he was just such a lovable, likable guy to begin with. Everyone who knew him, even the people he drove crazy, which was everyone, they all loved him dearly and just loved spending time with him, going golfing with him, shooting the breeze, playing poker. He was the number one guy in the world to hang out with. But to try and get work done in an efficient manner, that was another story. But that's not what you see on screen. You get the benefits of both sides of his personality. You get a stronger, tighter show because of his inefficient wandering and rambling. But also you get his wonderful sweetness, impishness, just how lovable he is. And that stays through, shines through, and I think will last forever. And as well, probably the show has never been as popular over the last 20 or 30 years as it's been just over the last year and a half during the pandemic. And this became this great go-to show. And I'm sure there's many reasons for that, but it's just sort of comforting in that it's so different from what else is popular today. All these intense, dark shows. It's the opposite. You know how it's going to turn out, before it even starts.
Right.
But yet it's still interesting. You don't know how it's going to get there. You're along for the ride with this, fun, lovable, non-threatening guy, and there's no intense car chases, and there's no, no gunfights or drug busts or, darkness. There's no curse words and, all the intense things that are brought to so many popular shows today. And it holds up. So you can go back to it and just sort of kick back and enjoy, sort of these mild suspenseful thrills.
I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but I was very curious about Tina and Lester Pine, who wrote the story, supposedly for Short Fuse with Jackson Gillis. Do you know anything about their version of that?
I don't. That's something I was not able to find. I would have loved to have seen what that started with, but that was a last minute episode. Lester and Tina Pine were a husband and wife writing team, primarily in the 70s. They have several other better known credits, but they were one of many, many writing teams through the 70s at Universal who would constantly be submitting spec scripts and story ideas to all the different, Mannix and and Canon and and everything, hoping somebody would bite and allow them to write it. And sometimes, so I don't know if they had sent in a spec script that Levinson and Link liked and had Jackson Gillis turn it into something larger or better, or if it just started out with just a 1 or 2 page idea of, hey, how about a story about this? And Levinson and Link, knowing that they were under the gun and they needed a script, literally they needed a finished script in 2 weeks, rather than go to somebody they hadn't worked with, go to someone they had, Jackson Gillis, and have him turn that into a script. So that's my guess of how that one came to be, is they sent in a story idea that had just the basic bare bones of the plot, and then gave it to Gillis, who turned it into that script. But they would, through the years, the Pines would submit other story ideas. And in fact, at one point, there was a circus episode that was planned late, about season 6, and they almost made it. It was almost made, in which the victim is murdered by a circus lion. So I'm not quite sure.
Oh yeah, I remember reading about that. It was so interesting.
How that comes to pass.
Yeah.
But a very elaborate episode, but it was just, especially the ending, was having trouble playing right. And Lester and Tina Pine were among the writers that they brought in for a rewrite. So they must have liked them well enough to give them a chance to do that. Although I will say, the internal notes on their version of the script, the fella in charge noted that something to the effect of, "This is the worst script I've ever read in my entire life." What are we paying these people for?
Oh no!
I understand they were very talented writers, even though that script and to me, short fuse don't necessarily prove it.
Yeah. So I guess we should start wrapping out, huh, Liz?
Yeah, we should wrap up here, David.
Okay.
We just have a couple questions. If you want to share what projects you're working on next, what's your next book going to be?
I'm pursuing a couple different areas, so nothing that I'm ready to announce or commit to yet. But right now, just hoping to talk as much about Columbo. Through my life, it's been hard to find other people who wanted to talk about Columbo. So now that I got a book about it, people will talk to me about Columbo all day long. So that's what I'm enjoying right now.
Awesome. Great. And where can people get your book and learn more about it?
The easiest place to get it is Amazon. Shooting Columbo. It's available as a regular hardcover, as an audiobook, as a Kindle version, and I really hope they enjoy it.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, David.
Yeah, thank you, pleasure. David.
Now, can I ask you guys one question before you leave?
Of course. As many as you want.
All right, just one. Now, during the podcast, I've heard a couple of it sounds like martinis being poured in the background. Is that for real?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, every podcast episode, we have a drink and a snack inspired by what we're watching on the show. So sometimes it's a martini, sometimes last week it was a Bloody Mary. So, but this morning it's coffee, David. Don't worry.
Yeah, coffee.
Right. That's nice. And with a hard-boiled egg, I hope.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
David, just really quick, if you had to pick like a favorite episode from the first run, do you have one, or Well,
all my favorites are from the first run, to be honest. If I did a list from 1 to 68, the first 20 would all be from the first run. But for different reasons, the Most Dangerous Match, the one about chess, is my earliest, fondest memory of Columbo. So I've always been fond of that. To me, the most touching one that touches my heart the most is Any Old Port in a Storm. And to me, the one maybe I enjoy most is Now You See 'Em. Those are my tops.
Awesome. I haven't seen those, or I may have seen them but don't remember them, so I can't wait to watch those then.
They're wonderful.
Great. Yeah, they're good ones. Okay. Thank you so much, David.
Thanks again,
Thanks
David.
for this opportunity. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Well, let's wrap this up. We'd like to thank Maxime Gervais for our theme song, Columbo.
Yes, Maxime.
Thank you. And if you'd like to add to our conversation, send us some interesting trivia or tidbits or your memories and your connection to Columbo. You can email us at trenchcoatcigar@gmail.com. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram. We are at Trenchcoat Cigar, and that's where we post photos of our drink and snack and our favorite moments from the episode. So head on over to Instagram and follow us on there. And Paul, just one more thing.
What's that, Liz?
Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.